The death of Pulitzer Prize-winning Chicago journalist Lois Wille, a veteran of the Tribune, the Sun-Times, and the Daily News, brings to mind a memorable 1997 interview with her and journalist Linda Lutton. You can hear them talk about urban housing trends that were remaking Chicago back then, and more than 2 decades later, are shaping it still. I'm Charlie Meyerson. Here's how it sounded as I interviewed them in a show that aired June 22nd, 1997, on WNUA-FM Chicago.
Facts, opinions, controversies, current events, technology, the arts. How they affect you, your family, your friends, or your business depends on your point of view. Now it's time for Point of View, a weekly forum for insight and information of importance to the Chicago area, produced by the news department of WNUA 95.5 Chicago. Here's your host, Charlie Meyerson.
Good morning, particularly if you live in Chicago's suburbs or if you spend all your city time in the heart of Chicago's Loop. I think you'd be surprised to learn that over the last 20 years, something remarkable has happened in downtown Chicago's backyard, or its South Yard anyway. An entire new neighborhood has risen from the ghost town of abandoned railroad yards. That rise is documented in a widely praised new book by our guest, 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner and former Chicago Tribune editorial page editor Lois Wille. The book is At Home in the Loop, How Clout and Community Built Chicago's Dearborn Park. Welcome to Point of View. It's an honor to meet you.
Thank you.
Paint a picture. What is Dearborn Park today? Where is it in relation to the landmarks that a lot of people may know about Chicago?
Well, Dearborn Park is sort of a long, narrow village plunked down just south of Polk Street. That's 800 South. And it lies between State Street and Clark Street, goes down to about 15th Street. That's 51 acres that at one time George Halas wanted to use for Chicago Bears Stadium.
Now out of the running.
Now out of the running.
And what does it look like as a community today? I mean, what is there?
It's a mix of housing. Its planners wanted to put a variety of housing units on the market. So you've got 2 high-rise buildings with 370-some units, some mid-rises that go up to about 6 stories, but a lot of townhouses. There are maybe 600, 700 townhouses that, I know it's been called a suburb in the city. I don't think it's got a suburban feel. People live much closer to each other, and it's a much denser feel. And also, the city is right there. It's right, you have a 15-minute walk to get up to, say, Fields. You can walk over to Soldier Field and the Grant Park Lakefront, the Grant Park Music Shell, the museums. So you really are in the city.
What demographic analyses, I should say, have there been? And paint that picture for us.
Good question, and I think that's where it differs from a lot of older city neighborhoods. It starts at about middle class and goes up from there. You can buy a condominium for $55,000 or $56,000, but it's small. It's really designed for one person. Houses go all the way up to $700,000 now. Most of the people who live there, I think, work in the downtown area. They work in the federal building centers or on LaSalle Street, which are short walks. There also are a lot of empty nesters moving in, people whose children are off to college. They lived somewhere in the city and they want something smaller and more convenient. So you get a wide range of ages, and you do get a wide range of racial and ethnic group. It's perhaps 55% Caucasian, maybe a third African American, the rest Hispanic and Asian American. Just from eyeballing it, I'd say Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic group. You don't have poor people. There are 200, I think maybe 200 apartments that are subsidized rental apartments, but for people 62 and older. It was not designed for low-income families.
Point of View on WNUA 95.5. Charlie Meyerson talking to Pulitzer Prize winner Lois Wille, the author of At Home in the Loop, How Clout and Community Built Chicago's Dearborn Park. Well, let's tell that story. How did clout and community build Dearborn Park?
Dearborn Park began in 1970, one spring day, when 3 Chicago executives, the head of Commonwealth Edison, Sears Roebuck, and Continental Bank, had just concluded a business meeting and were looking out of the window of Tom Ayers, the Commonwealth Edison chief, at the long stretch of hundreds of acres of empty railroad yards south of the Loop, most of which were abandoned at that time. They were also worried about the condition of the Loop in general. In the early 70s, it was beginning to lose a lot of its business, a lot of its customers. The big theaters and restaurants were closing.
This is a story told nationwide in big city after big city after big city.
And they wanted to prevent Chicago from becoming another Detroit or Atlanta, Cleveland, other cities whose downtowns were decaying. Also, they had extensive real estate investments in the Loop. So they got some studies done, they talked to some other people, and they concluded the best way to shore up the Loop and bring round-the-clock life to the city was to create a residential development right practically in the heart of the downtown. And it was designed for middle-class people, the kinds of people who were moving to the suburbs. They wanted to give them an alternative right in the city and in the heart of the city. The business leaders raised about $14 million in seed capital from Chicago corporations. They used that to buy the 51 acres that I mentioned. Hallis had wanted for a stadium. When the first mayor, Daley, said no, he wanted to keep the Bears in Soldier Field, Hallis gave them his option. So they spent about half of their capital, $7 million, for the land. They used the rest to leverage loans for construction and then for mortgage money, and had a terrible time because inflation hit just when Dearborn Park was going to go on the market in the early 80s. They survived just by the skin of their teeth time after time. Finally opened in 1979. Those original investors, incidentally, never did get their $14 million back. They got about 41 cents on the dollar.
Did the revolving door at City Hall in these years, from the first Mayor Daley to Mayor Belanek to Mayor Byrne to Mayor Washington, Mayor Sawyer, and then Mayor Daley II, make a difference in the way Dearborn Park developed? Help it? Hinder it?
It didn't make a difference because they were able, because of their influence, to persuade each succeeding mayor this is the way we want it to be. And each eventually went along, although that took time. The toughest sell was Mayor Washington, which I guess isn't surprising. When it came time to develop the southern half of Dearborn Park, they wanted the city to provide streets and sidewalks and sewers, which it had done in the northern half. The Washington administration said, hey, this is successful now. You people represent rich corporations. Why should we provide this? And they said, well, the first Mayor Daley promised. Or they didn't say the first Mayor Daley. I guess there was only one at that time.
There would be a second Mayor Daley at that point.
And it was not the way to impress Washington. So actually it took them 3 years to persuade him and his cabinet, which had kind of a collegial way of decision-making, that it was in the city's interests, because of the property taxes they would get back, to provide the infrastructure.
Point of View on WNUA 95.5. We're talking to Lois Wille, whose book is At Home in the Loop, How Cloud and Community Built Chicago's Dearborn Park. You live, at least part of the time, in Dearborn Park now. Now, how did that come to be?
Well, my husband and I live in Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where we went to when we left Chicago in 1992. When I started work on the book, I bumped into John Madigan, the head of Tribune Company, in a bookstore downtown, and he asked what I was doing in town, and I told him, and he said, I think the Tribune has a little studio apartment there. Let me look into it and see if we still have it. They did. They bought it. One of the times when Dearborn Park was about to go under, Tom Ayers twisted the arms of a lot of corporations to buy these little studios, and the Tribune had one. So we lived there while we were doing on the research. My husband helped with a lot of the research and the editing. And when we finished it, our last trip there, we thought, this is terrific. We like coming back to Chicago. Here we can walk everywhere. The resale of these little studios had picked up a lot of students by them because there are so many colleges and universities in the area. We thought, we don't have anything to lose if we can get a little one-room efficiency and If it turns out we don't use it, we'll sell it. And so we bought that about a year ago and have loved having it.
So the work on the book had been done by the time you
Yes,
decided it. So
right.
there's
Right,
not that
because it was
potential
going to be
conflict.
our farewell to
Yeah.
Dearborn Park when we decided we didn't want to say goodbye.
It's Point of View on WNUA 95.5. I'm Charlie Meyerson talking to Lois Wille, author of At Home in the Loop, How Clout and Community Built Chicago's Dearborn Park. And I want to welcome to the discussion now someone with maybe a different perspective on the rise of the South Loop. It's reporter Linda Lutton, who's written for the Chicago magazine Neighborhood Works, Building Alternative Visions for the City. She's a resident of the Pilsen neighborhood on Chicago's near southwest side. And in her piece for the latest edition of Neighborhood Works, she writes a story, a warning about the problems posed by gentrification, the upscaling of Chicago's neighborhoods. It's called There Goes the Neighborhood. Ms. Lutton has done reporting also for the Chicago Reader and in these times, and welcome to Point of View for you.
Thank you.
What do you have to say about the South Loop, gentrification, Dearborn Park?
Well, I guess it fits into I would say the development of Dearborn Park fits into a larger strategy that came about, in the early 70s when the business leaders were thinking what could they do with these empty railroad yards, and what could they do to revitalize the Loop and the downtown area. The answer that they came up with was to upscale a whole area surrounding the Loop, and that of course included Dearborn Park and the South Loop. So, yeah, I feel like this is just a piece of the gentrification puzzle, if you will.
Well, has it been good for the city or bad, in your estimation?
Well, I think that it's brought some costs with it, without a question. Oftentimes, the city is obviously put in a bind with a fleeing middle class, loss of a tax base, and I think one thing we need to consider is that often the people who really pay in the end for upscale development are the poor. In the case of the South Loop, particularly the homeless. There's a very large homeless population that lives now in the South Loop and has lived there, but it's becoming they're feeling increasing pressures to leave that area, and surrounding areas are affected as well as development threatens to spread to other communities.
Ms. Wille, did the Dearborn Park project in any sense displace anybody? I mean, there were no buildings there, or very few buildings that were occupied. Was there any sort of homeless population there when they started back in the
It was
70s?
railroad tracks.
Yeah.
I mean, there was nobody living there.
Not even hobos
And
making
as far
campfires.
The city spent, if you add up all the money it spent on infrastructure and park development and so forth, about $18 million. It now gets well over $5 million a year in real estate tax revenue, the city and its school system from that area. So that money was quickly paid off. It's true there has been a sizable homeless population, or at least people who lived in some of the transient single-room occupancy hotels in the area. Several of them were torn down because they were fire traps. The city and a group of private agencies are soon to open a new, I believe it's 170-unit apartment building for single-room occupancy residents, and another one is in the works. So their aim is to replace one for one every old, what used to be called, the flop houses or Skid Row hotels in that area.
Yeah, Ms. Lutton, is it naive to say, here's a project that's gone up where there was essentially nothing, and yeah, maybe there aren't any poor people living in this part of Chicago now, or that they are in short supply, but here are people who are taxpayers who are pumping money into the city's economy, and that in a sense makes Chicago stronger and better able to care for the needs of people elsewhere in the city. Is that a naive point of view? What do you think?
I think in part it's somewhat misguided. The figures I have are actually quite different for the investments that the city has made in infrastructure for the South Loop. Up to 1990, I believe that figures $50 million in infrastructure for Dearborn Park.
50? 5-0?
50.
No, that's incorrect. You may be talking about the South Loop as a whole. And I think that point is well taken, that when Dearborn Park was clearly a success, other conversions of old buildings were undertaken, and new townhouses went up. And then the city began pouring in money in rebuilding Roosevelt Road, which was crumbling, a new Roosevelt Road viaduct, connecting it to Lakeshore Drive, moving Lakeshore Drive, things that actually had been in the works for decades, but the city never had been motivated to do it. So if you want to look at the public investment in the area as a whole now, you're probably more like $120, $130 million. But that theoretically will benefit the city as a whole. But remember that most of the South Loop land is still undeveloped, or the near south side. There are hundreds of acres of unused railroad tracks still there. So, now we'll see
and
what,
that's a good question.
what will happen next.
What goes there?
Well, I think that's where this great concern comes up about the poor and the homeless continuing to feel increased pressure. The community areas of the Loop and the near south side, which encompass much more than the Dearborn Park neighborhood, really. But this shows the effect that upscaling of even of a small area can have on the surrounding areas. Have lost 5,000 SRO units in the same period, really, when Dearborn Park was being built, between 73 and 93. And in that area now, there's currently, I believe, 760 SRO units, a drastic reduction. And another thing that I think, often this is presented as a victimless instance of development. The pictures that can be seen of Dearborn Park before development are very stark. All you see is railroad tracks, but I think the effect it does come up in the end. And to respond to your question about whether increased revenues from property taxes will make it easier for the city to really provide services to lower income families and individuals as well. I think one thing that we're seeing with the displacement of the poor is in some ways the poor are being decentralized. They're being pushed out as far as the suburbs, and people in the southern suburbs certainly know that. In some of the western suburbs, even in some of the northern suburbs, are beginning to feel that. And I think that's going to definitely have a cost. That decentralization of the poor is going to be much more difficult, in fact, to provide services to people who need them.
Point of view on WNUA 95.5. Our guests are Pulitzer Prize winner Lois Wille, author of At Home in the Loop, and Linda Lutton, who's written for, among other things, Neighborhood Works. What's worked and what hasn't in Dearborn Park?
Well, Dearborn Park is a very pleasant place to live, and it's kept people in the city, or brought a lot of people from the suburbs into the city who are paying taxes. It's spawned a lot of additional development. The aim of the developers in the first place was just to do a pilot project, and then to have all the empty acres, I think there were 600 acres in all, be filled by other developers. Some of that has happened, but Linda's point is certainly well taken. I think the next stage of development has to be family-type housing for low-income people. The city's got a program called New Homes for Chicago that would be ideal there. It's used to subsidize sale units. In other words, you bring down the price of the home for sale rather than subsidize rents, month after month, forever. I think that there should be now a mix of housing, including low-income families in the South Loop. Also, but to get back to the question of decentralization of the poor, I think the worst planning decision Chicago ever made came in the 40s and 50s and, I don't know, maybe 60s, when it decided to centralize the poor and put them in these huge high-rise bins that you can trace school problems, problems of joblessness, so many other problems to Chicago's high-rise public housing development that isolated the poor.
Recently there's been quite a few attacks, obviously very real attacks on public housing and the notions of what went on in the 60s, building the building of the projects. And I don't think anyone would defend the projects as a a good situation even for the people who live there. But I also don't think that this should be a time when we're constructing equally isolated communities of wealthy people, which is what I think a lot of people from the outside view Dearborn Park as. One thing that Ms. Wiley didn't mention in her description of the area is that it's a very walled, gated community.
Oh, wait, it's not gated. Anyone can walk in. There are houses that open right onto State Street. There are only 2 access roads. 2 you can't drive through. They wanted to reduce traffic. But you can walk in from all over. There are no gates.
Well, I've walked in actually on my way home toward Pilsen, thinking there might be thinking there might be
front yard.
thinking there might be a way out. For pedestrians, I knew that you couldn't get out by Roosevelt Road via car, but I thought, well, they'll at least have a stairwell there, and they didn't. So I had to ask for a hand up from somebody from the bridge there.
There's a sidewalk. Roosevelt Road, you get right onto State Street with a sidewalk. Roosevelt Road was rebuilt to get to grade level on State Street, so you can walk out through there.
No.
Or in.
All right. Is this a model in any way for other communities? Is there anything here for other communities, other suburbs, other big cities, other neighborhoods in Chicago to learn from Dearborn Park, or is it something that was unique to that place and time? We'll start with you, Ms. Lutton.
One of the things that I think was definitely good about Dearborn Park was the real interest in that the government and also business interests put there. That they put a lot of their efforts there. Although I don't agree with the idea that they didn't get they didn't ever receive their $14 million investment back. I think they've seen that and more. Although maybe nobody handed them the cash, they've seen that in other ways through the increases in their own property values and other investments. But I think it would be wonderful if this model could be repeated in neighborhoods that desperately need infrastructure improvements in living situations, in housing stock. If this much interest could be taken by government and private interests for people who live there without the threat of displacement.
Ms. Wille?
I think that's true. One problem, and the thing that made Dearborn Park work and made it possible is that the land was empty. It's finding an empty tract to do that sort of thing with. But obviously, Linda's right. The city does need to put more money into deteriorating neighborhoods. You can't waste them. I think one interesting project along those lines is, the old Sears property in Lawndale that Charles Shaw is redeveloping. Sears really kind of gave it to him, saying, do what you can with this. Holman Square,
yeah.
Which will have a mix of income units. It will also have job training. They hope to do some incubator industries right there. I think ultimately that may turn out to be to have more of a positive impact on the city even than Dearborn Park. And that's kind of what I like to think of as the ideal for the future.
Our guests on Point of View on WNUA 95.5 have been reporter Linda Lutton of the magazine Neighborhood Works and other publications, and Lois Wille, whose book is At Home in the Loop, How Clout and Community Built Chicago's Dearborn Park, $29.95 from SIU Press. I'm Charlie Myerson. Thank you both for coming, and thanks to all of you folks out there for tuning in.
Thank you.
This has been Point of View, a weekly forum for insight and information of importance to the Chicago area. The views expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of WNUA 95.5 or Evergreen Media Corporation. If you have any comments or questions, send them to WNUA News, Suite 300, 444 North Michigan, Chicago 60611. Our email address is wnuanews@aol.com. Point of View is an exclusive presentation of the news department of WNUA 95.5, Chicago.